The Valley of the Jordan was once a masterpiece of creation, a lush emerald sanctuary that shimmered like a reflection of Eden itself. Here, the twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah stood as monuments to human ingenuity and prosperity. Travelers, weary from the harsh, arid winds of the desert, would crest the ridges to see them, vast, sprawling hubs of trade, where the air hummed with the sound of commerce and the wealth of nations flowed through iron-reinforced gates. They were cities of intoxicating luxury, where the soil was perpetually fertile and the coffers were eternally full. Yet, there is a darkness that feeds upon ease. Within the gilded walls of Sodom, a rot had taken hold, hidden deep beneath the veneer of sophistication. The people had long since looked toward the heavens for guidance, trading their reverence for a cold, unchecked indulgence. Justice had been hollowed out, replaced by the law of the strong. The cries of the vulnerable, the poor, the widowed, and the stranger went unanswered, stifled by the relentless laughter of the elite. Pride had become their foundational virtue, and cruelty was dressed in the robes of sophistication. Ezekiel would later look back through the lens of history, distilling their wretchedness into a haunting verdict. They were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They had turned their backs on the suffering of their neighbors and committed abominations that stained the very earth upon which they walked. The corruption reached a tipping point, a threshold where the weight of iniquity became too heavy for the heavens to ignore. The air in the celestial courts grew thick with the reports of their depravity. And so the Creator of the heavens and the earth chose to descend, not as a storm of war, but as a silent observer, to bear witness to the truth of their state.
On a scorching afternoon, under the shade of the ancient oaks of Mamre, Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent. The heat waves rippled across the horizon, distorting the landscape, when suddenly 3 figures appeared. They did not approach like weary wanderers. They moved with a gravity that commanded attention. Abraham, a man accustomed to the presence of the divine, rose instantly. His spirit recognized that these were not mere men of flesh. He moved with urgency, bowing low, his voice tempered by profound reverence. "My Lord," he murmured, "if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass by your servant." He offered the hospitality of the desert, water for their feet, the rest of the shade, and the best of his table. The 3 guests accepted. As they ate, the atmosphere shifted. The light seemed to concentrate around the central figure, the Lord himself. And then the conversation turned to the inevitable. The outcry against the cities of the plain had reached the throne of heaven. Their sin was grievous, and the time for a final reckoning had arrived. As the 2 angelic companions moved towards the valley, Abraham remained, standing before the majesty of the universe. He did not shrink away. He understood the heart of his Creator, and he dared to stand in the gap.
"Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" Abraham asked, his voice steadying despite the weight of his question. He began a desperate, rhythmic negotiation. If there were 50 righteous, would the city be spared? Then 45, then 40, 30, 20. Each time the Lord's response was a testament to his infinite patience. Finally, Abraham leaned into the silence. "What if only 10 are found there?" "For the sake of 10, the Lord replied, I will not destroy it." The negotiation ended. The Lord departed, and Abraham stood alone under the vast, darkening sky, his heart heavy with a singular, agonizing hope that within the depths of that corrupt metropolis there remained a remnant of 10 souls who held to the light. As the shadows lengthened across the valley,
the two angels arrived at the gates of Sodom. There sat Lot, a man whose life had become a series of compromises. Drawn years earlier by the promise of prosperity, he had chosen to plant his life in soil that was fundamentally toxic. Yet, as the angels approached, his old instincts for hospitality surfaced. He bowed low, urging them to seek shelter in his home, acutely aware that the city square was no place for strangers after dark. The angels initially declined, intending to stay in the open, but Lot knew the true nature of his neighbors. He pressed them until they consented. Inside the sanctuary of his home, the evening felt tense, but before the night could settle, the peace was shattered. A guttural roar rose from the street, a surging mob of men, young and old, surrounding the house. They hammered at the door, their voices thick with malice and perverted desire, demanding that Lot hand over his guests. Lot stepped out, shielding the door behind him. He pleaded, his voice cracking, imploring them to remember the sanctity of the guest. In a moment of absolute moral confusion, a tragic byproduct of the environment he had allowed to shape him, Lot offered his own daughters to the mob, hoping to appease their insatiable hunger. It was a harrowing, desperate act that underscored just how far the contagion of Sodom had reached. The crowd did not listen. They lunged at him, sensing his weakness, ready to tear down the walls. In that heartbeat of imminent violence, the strangers acted. They struck the mob with a sudden, supernatural blindness. The roar of the crowd turned into a frantic, stumbling chaos, a sea of hands groping at the dark, unable to find their target. The angels turned to Lot. The facade of the city was crumbling. The time for mercy was ending. "Do you have anyone else here?" they commanded. "Get them out of this place. We are going to destroy it." Lot hurried to his sons-in-law, his warnings frantic. But they laughed. To them, the idea of divine judgment was a joke, an absurdity in a world that believed its own myths of invincibility. At the first light of dawn, the angels seized Lot, his wife and his daughters by the hands. They did not wait for his hesitation. They forcibly led them toward the city limits. The command was absolute. Flee for your lives. Do not look back, and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Lot, still trembling, bargained for a nearby small town, Zoar. The angels granted his request, but their urgency was palpable. Then the sky opened. It was not a natural storm. It was a torrential downpour of fire and burning sulfur, raining from the heavens with the force of absolute judgment. The horizon, once peaceful, erupted in a hellish glow. Sodom and Gomorrah were engulfed in a furnace that turned the night into a blinding, terrifying day. The earth groaned as buildings turned to ash, and the very ground seemed to liquefy. In the midst of the flight, Lot's wife looked back. Was it longing? Was it a momentary rebellion against the loss of her life? The text does not explain, but her gaze toward the burning city became her final act. Her body stiffened, the moisture leaving her skin in an instant, and she became a pillar of salt, a permanent, silent witness to the cost of looking back at what God has already declared dead.
Lot, broken and stripped of everything he had built, fled into the mountains. He eventually found shelter in a dark, isolated cave, where the trauma of the night and the moral decay of their upbringing bore one last bitter fruit. His daughters, isolated and desperate to preserve their line, made a choice that would tether the future of nations to the memory of that night, birthing the Moabites and Ammonites, peoples who would long dwell in the shadow of that tragedy. The destruction of the cities of the plain remains one of history's most chilling warnings. It is a narrative that speaks of the patience of the Almighty, who watches and waits,
delaying justice until the very last moment that mercy allows. But it also speaks to the danger of drifting, of living in a city of corruption and slowly, imperceptibly adopting its values. Lot, broken and stripped of everything he had built, fled into the mountains. He eventually found shelter in a dark, isolated cave, where the trauma of the night and the moral decay of their upbringing bore one last bitter fruit. His daughters, isolated and desperate to preserve their line, made a choice that would tether the future of nations to the memory of that night, birthing the Moabites and Ammonites, peoples who would long dwell in the shadow of that tragedy. The destruction of the cities of the plain remains one of history's most chilling warnings. It is a narrative that speaks of the patience of the Almighty, who watches and waits, delaying justice until the very last moment that mercy allows. But it also speaks to the danger of drifting, of living in a city of corruption and slowly, imperceptibly adopting its values.
The story is not meant to leave us in fear, but to awaken us. We are called to be an anomaly, a light in the darkness that does not flicker when the wind of culture shifts. To follow the narrow path is to reject the popular, to cherish the sacred over the superficial, and to build one's life on the bedrock of truth rather than the shifting sands of human approval. Judgment is real, but so is the way of escape. There is always a gate, narrow and small, that leads to life. It requires the courage to leave the city behind and the faith to keep our eyes fixed forward, never glancing back at the flames, trusting that the hand that reaches down to pull us from the fire is the same hand that guides us towards a future that will never turn to ash.